Welcome to my podcast. I'm Jeanne Ives, and on our podcast, I plan to inform you about what's going on here locally, whether it's a federal project, state policy, or something your local government's doing. I'm here to bring experts to you so that you can understand better what's going on with government in your lives. There's a lot to talk about today, but starting at the top, I want to just explain a little bit of something that's going on. My assistant, who used to run In the Spotlight, which was our podcast back in the day, is Kathleen Murphy. She is no longer with Breakthrough Ideas. She has moved on to much bigger adventures. She has signed on as Jesse Sullivan's Lieutenant Governor running mate. We wish her well as she continues to campaign around the state in hopes of winning the primary on June 28th. Now, there's a couple things I do want to let you know. If you did not receive our emails, I encourage you to sign up for our weekly emails. I laid everything out there, and you'll get a recap of all the work that we've done here at Breakthrough Ideas throughout the week. You can go to breakthrough-ideas.com to sign up for that email. But back to Kathleen. Just so you know, Kathleen has worked for me and alongside me for 10 years as my legislative assistant, my campaign communications director, and most recently as the co-founder of Breakthrough Ideas. Breakthrough Ideas will continue. Don't worry about that. But more than anything, Kathleen and I do believe that Governor Pritzker must not be elected. His policies do not reflect our Midwestern values of the people who live here, and the governor has literally made our state worse off. He's governed the last 2 years off of emergency orders like a tyrant would. And he's made no substantial reform to our various fiscal problems that we have. So for that reason, Kathleen saw hope in Jesse Sullivan as a candidate for governor, and she's joined his team. Now, Breakthrough Ideas will continue its important messaging about key policies being debated in Congress, in the State House, and on the local levels. We will continue to weigh in on issues that concern the people of this great state. We look forward to hosting top national figures that can energize and inform the grassroots. And so we do invite you to join us and sign up for our email list so that you're informed as well. One other thing that I need to make clear here, we are a 501c4 organization. And this organization, Breakthrough Ideas, will not be making an endorsement in the governor's race. However, I myself personally am considering all the Republican candidates for governor and assessing each candidate and their campaign's ability to win before making my own personal endorsement. So again, to be clear, I'm not endorsing any particular team at this time in the Republican primary. So back to the big news of the day. Well, everything exploded on Friday. We did our podcast and we've been waiting for 2 weeks now. What is going to happen with this mask lawsuit that Tom DeVore had taken a hold of? And Friday we got our answer. At 4:45, the judge brought down her order, and she essentially said that the TRO is approved, that there's a temporary restraining order, and that this holds across the state to the 146 school districts that were sued, and that the plaintiffs in those, and it actually holds even across all the students in that school district, whether or not they were a plaintiff, a named plaintiff in that lawsuit. This is really big news. This is the start of the end of the tyranny of Governor Pritzker and the Democrats. This is ground-shaking news. And if you've not been watching, or maybe you don't have kids in school, it has been incredible this morning. I'm taping this on a Monday afternoon, but this morning when kids went back to school, there was all sorts of chaos going on in the suburbs. It was unbelievable. But back to the temporary restraining order, the judge said quite a few things. She granted the temporary restraining order against Governor Pritzker, the Illinois State Board of Education, the Illinois Department of Health, and approximately 146 school districts. She had a lot of key quotes that she put in her statement. I would just want to read a few of them. She basically said about this emergency order, about the emergency order that required your schools to mask the children, to contact trace them so that they could be quarantined, whether or not they're healthy, and then for the teachers to require vaccination or testing. She said that this type of evil is exactly what the law was intended to constrain. She said all IDPH did was take away individual due process rights and pass the responsibilities of healthcare issues to another administrative agency. Here's another important quote, and I appreciate that the Edgar County Watchdogs laid these all out in their article. She said that since 2014 and prior to the recent 2021 emergency rules, tests and vaccines were also considered a form of modified quarantine because they were a procedure intended to limit disease transmission. Under the IDPH Act, individuals had the right to object to these procedures. If they objected, they were afforded due process of law. Likewise, exclusion from school was also a form of modified quarantine because it was considered a partial limitation on freedom of movement for those who may have been exposed to a contagious disease. At no time did the 2014 emergency amendments take away a person's due process rights. She went on to say, thus, absent a properly filed emergency rule from IDPH, the governor's mandate is meaningless, and ISB's emergency rule exceeded its authority. Then she said in another place, how is this a threat to public safety? It is not. It is a threat to an unilateral, unchecked exercise of authority by the executive branch. Stated differently, IDPH's delegation of its authority was an end run whereby IDPH, that's the Illinois Department of Public Health, passed the buck to schools so as not to trigger the due process protections under the IDPH Act. Courts should not be fooled or misled by this egregious conduct. So she also addressed some other issues as well. But what is really important here, and what there's a whole, there's all this chaos going on in school districts around the state, is that she did not grant that there was a class action saying that all people, all students, all 2.1 million students in the state of Illinois are going to be part of this temporary restraining order, saying that they are allowed to go into school en masse. She denied the class action, okay? But in her footnotes, she very clearly said that these emergency rules are illegal and therefore void. So the interpretation, and the right interpretation in my opinion, and I'm not a lawyer, but the plain language is pretty straightforward. Anybody can understand it. The interpretation of that is that you cannot deny somebody, or you cannot quarantine them, and masking is a form of modified quarantine. You cannot do that without due process. And the only way to achieve due process is to take every single person through a court process and assess their own individual health situation. And if you fail to provide due process, then you've created an illegal action against the individual. And so she essentially said these emergency rules are illegal and void. And if they're illegal and void for one student, guess what? They're illegal and void for every student. And so you've got school districts that there's up in arms about what to do. But here to explain it clearer is Tom DeVore. He's the attorney. He's the downstate attorney who has been going around the state and for 2 years telling people that you have due process rights and that we need to stand up for them. And if bureaucrats who run your school districts won't listen, we're just going to have to sue them. So he is the man who put together this lawsuit suing 146 different districts, including CPS, Chicago Public Schools, including the one that my daughter goes to. And he won. He won this lawsuit, and we're really thrilled. I thank him big time, and let's listen to Tom DeVore explain the reasoning.
Ruling, right? Granting the TRO. Granting the TRO, what she says is that the school districts cannot rely upon the governor's executive orders, can't rely upon ISB's guidance, can't rely upon IDPH joint guidance with ISB, can't rely upon IDPH emergency rules, can't rely upon ISB, and the school districts cannot rely upon their own inherent authority to mandate masks on children or students, or children or staff, and you cannot exclude children without following the law, and you can't require vaccination or testing of, she says staff. Is she referring only to teachers? I don't think so, even though that's how we pled the case for the most part. She says staff. Those issues will have to be ferreted out. But she says that all of those issues, people have due process under the law, which is what I've been arguing since March of 2020. I've been arguing the same thing since March of 2020. My arguments have never changed. But here we are now with Judge Grishow, who disagreed with me for her own good reasons a year and a half ago, now finds herself calling the actions of the governor and these agencies the type of evil that the law was intended to refute. And she's right. She also goes on to say, which I thought was important, that what they were doing, the governor and his agencies, was a workaround to the court's involvement into the rule of law. I agree with her. She also said that they were trying to pass the buck on to the local school districts and make them the bad guys, which I agree with her. We all knew, anybody that watched those hearings knew what was going on, right? It was plainly obvious, the games they were playing and the rule of law that they were ignoring, because as Ms. Haggard said, well, if we give people due process, then the system might break down. Well, that's not a reason to disregard the law, okay? So, you guys saw the footnotes. You're asking me about the footnotes that the judge had entered. Let's talk about those for a second. Even though the judge denied the class certification, and her TRO as it exists today technically only applies to the students and to the teachers listed. It's not as big a deal as you would think. I'll get to that. She says that she is finding that the governor, nor ISB, nor IDPH, nor the school districts have any authority under the law to mandate masks, to exclude kids, or to require vaccination or testing without giving due process under the law. She says that unequivocally, that is her finding in her order. So when she puts in those footnotes that school districts should conduct themselves accordingly, what she's saying to them is that even though this order, this injunction may not directly apply to you, I'm still saying what you're doing, if you choose to continue voluntarily, it's illegal. Does that make sense? I want you guys to understand. It's the most important thing I've got to say to you today. The TRO that she granted, technically, from an enforcement perspective, only applies to the named plaintiffs today. But her ruling, her lawful ruling that she issued, is still telling school districts, you can't do what you're doing. You know, it's illegal. So each and every one of your school districts is right now, when you get these letters that we're looking at this, here's what they're having. Here's the conversation that they're having. Is that, yeah, this order, even let me be clear, even school districts that aren't named in this lawsuit. This is not just, for the 146.
Does Mr. Dvore sound like a grifter? Does he sound like somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about? Does he sound like somebody who's just trying to take advantage of, about 700 kids and parents who decided to sue the governor because they wanted to go unmasked? Does he sound like that type of guy? No, he's not. He's a hero. He's a hero. Tom DeVore is a hero, but not according to our governor. When Tom went ahead and filed this lawsuit, and it was, in October, by the way, J.B. Pritzker responded by calling him a grifter. Yeah, our governor responded by calling him a grifter. Now, Tom DeVore's got a separate lawsuit against Governor Pritzker for those remarks. That is defamation. And I expect that Tom DeVore may very well win that lawsuit. Now, what's unique about Tom DeVore is that he's a downstate lawyer. Really, I don't think anybody really knew him prior to him getting involved with the Darren Bailey case, suing the governor against his illegal 30-day emergency orders, which, by the way, he filed his 24th emergency order on Friday, just before this TRO got released. The governor filed his 24th continuous emergency order, and it's good through March 5th. So he wants to keep this game going. He wants to keep this charade going. He would prefer to control your life in perpetuity for as long as he's in office. But, you know, it was Tom DeVore. Tom DeVore, this downstate lawyer nobody really knew about, that stood up for parents, that said, this is illegal, and I know it is, and you have due process rights, and they can't quarantine you. And he knew what the law. He knew the facts. Guess who didn't do that? Guess who didn't do that? All the high-priced lawyers sitting in their cushy offices in the center of Chicago. All those sophisticated lawyers in the suburbs. Where were they? Where were they? Where were they? Nowhere to be found. And yet their kids were suffering too. They didn't like this either. This is a politically charged lawsuit, and nobody would take it on except Mr. Dvore. Nobody. And he beat him. Now, the governor's appealing this temporary restraining order. And I just heard prior to starting this podcast that they'll make a decision on whether or not that appeal is successful within 2 weeks. You know what's unfortunate? Your school boards are hoping that it's successful. Your school boards want to keep this going on. What did I spend my Sunday afternoon doing yesterday? Well, my own particular school district called an emergency meeting to determine what to do on the basis of this lawsuit. So they, went into closed session for an hour and a half and finally came back and said, we're going masks recommended. Why? Because they were individually sued. They knew that the game's up. They knew that they could not go through quarantine orders for every single student and prove up that they're a health risk in order to meet the due process requirements of requiring a mask. So they did the right thing, but guess what? They would just as soon prefer to not do the right thing. They would prefer to be on the side of the governor. Now, when this TRO came out, thankfully, Timothy Christian, which wasn't one of the first people when Governor Rauner said, Rauner, geez, they're the same, they're both tyrants. When Governor Pritzker said on August 4th, he sent out the missive saying, the whole state is going, students are going to be maxed and contact traced, and teachers are going to be vaccinated or tested and all this other stuff. When that all happened, Timothy Christian said, no, we're not. We're just going to go mask optional. And then within 24 hours, they reversed themselves because ISB, the Illinois State Board of Education, was threatening them, threatening to take their accreditation away, threatening to not let their students participate in high school sports. So they reversed themselves. But as soon as this TRO was out, Timothy Christian was the first that I saw to say, whoop, we're mask optional. Parents, you decide. Parents, you're in charge of your child's health. Parents, we trust you to make the right decision. So there's a website. It's kind of interesting. It's Illinois High School Sports Central. And they are keeping an updated list going about how many people are, how many schools are going mask optional. And it's an enormous list now. I'm looking at it right now. I haven't refreshed. Oh, we're at 212 now. So that's pretty good. Yep. So that's good. Yeah. And then, the other thing that Tom DeVore did, and by the way, he's not even in the state right now. He did this, what you just heard, his little thing. He was on a trip to California, but he still took the wherewithal to go ahead and put up this. And it's because he really cares. He cares about the children. And so immediately, because there were a number of schools that were not making the decision to unmask the kids for Monday's classes starting, parents were fiercely looking for a solution. What do we do? What do we do? And so at the same website, Illinois High School Sports Central, you can go there and you'll see a letter, and it's essentially a fill in the blank letter, and it essentially informs your principal about this ruling and how it really affects every student in every school in the state of Illinois, and except for private schools. That's another story. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And so Tom DeVore put this up. You can look at it. I encourage you to go to that website, and when we get a chance, I'll be putting that out on Facebook. So he's already looking for options. There are other parents who have contacted me, and I'm sure many other folks who are saying, how do I sue my school district? They were not party to the lawsuit. They were not one of the 146 sued, and they're still requiring my child to mask. So Tom's going to be at this again. There's no doubt that he's going to be awfully busy settling this out, which is shameful because the right thing to do is for all these school districts to just decide. You can do what you want. But it was chaos. Today in Hinsdale, we've got video of it. I don't have it teed up for this podcast, but we'll be putting it out here shortly. But they were segregating kids who came in without a mask and sending them to the gym. And there were parents in the parent groups talking about segregating kids between the mask and the unmasked. Well, how many different combinations can you come up with? I mean, oh, I'm maxed and vaxxed. I'm one group. I'm vaxxed. I don't want a mask. I'm another group. I'm unvaxxed, unmasked. I'm another group. I'm natural immunity and I'll mask. That's another group. Natural immunity, unmasked. I mean, you could just continue to segregate these kids all day long. And what are you going to do? Hire segregation enforcers? I mean, it's just ridiculous, the amount of hysteria that is going on over this mask optional policy, which is essentially what the judge decided. You decide. You decide, but what you're doing right now is illegal and void. And these school districts want to fight it, and the biggest losers in this have been the Catholic schools.